The reparations receipt Britain has buried for 200 years. In 1834, clerks in London counted out £20 million for the slave owners. Every note, every bond, went to the people who had held human beings as property. Not one penny reached a single freed man, woman, or child. You were taught that Britain ended slavery out of pure conscience. The receipt says something colder. Britain paid the slaveholders for their lost property and handed the bill to taxpayers, who kept paying it until the year 2015. Tonight, you are going to read that receipt, line by line, name by name. Now watch what is happening in our own time. In July 2026, the CARICOM nations and the African Union stood together in Accra, Ghana, and adopted a 19-point reparations manifesto. Leaders like Mia Mottley of Barbados and John Mahama of Ghana put their names to it, and within hours, the outraged machine roared to life. Many commentators called it a cartel, a shakedown, a grievance industry begging for money that no living person owes. Between you and me, I have heard that argument 100 times, and every time it leans on one thing, that you do not know the receipt exists. So let me end that tonight. Here is what they never mention. When slavery was abolished across the British Empire, the government did pay reparations. That is not just my opinion. Many historians now document it in detail. It paid roughly £20 million, but it paid the wrong side of the whip. The money went to the masters for the loss of their property, and the human property who had bled for that wealth received nothing. Reparations already happened once, and many of us were never told it. They just went to the men who signed the ledgers, not the people whose names filled them. Stay with me, because I am going to give you the exact figure, the exact date, and the exact place you can go to read the names yourself. Here is where I land before we even begin. None of this is a rumor whispered in a barbershop. There is a public archive at University College London called the Legacies of British Slave Ownership Database, and it lists the payments by name. The debt Britain took on to pay those owners was so enormous that British taxpayers only finished paying it off in 2015. I have sat with that fact for a long time. This is not a theory you have to believe on faith. It is a ledger, and once you have read a ledger, you cannot unread it. So let us open it together. Let me show you the argument first, because you have heard it, and you will hear it again. Many critics say reparations are absurd. They say slavery ended almost 200 years ago. They say, no one alive today ever owned a slave, and no one alive today was ever enslaved. So the whole demand is a fantasy dressed up as justice. They call it a grievance industry. They say the ledgers are closed, the graves are cold, and the accounts can never be settled, because everyone who could sign them is dust. Most commentators present this as simple common sense. But I have come to see it differently. Common sense only works when you have the whole story, and this argument survives on the half that is missing. And notice how tidy that argument is. It never asks you to look at a document. It never points you to a figure. It just tells you the past is unreachable and dares you to feel foolish for reaching. It is designed to close a door before you ever try the handle. I understand the appeal of it. It is comfortable. It lets a nation set down a heavy thing without ever picking it up. But comfort is not the same as truth, and a closed door is not the same as an empty room. Because here is the question the critics never ask out loud. Who benefits when that framing goes unchallenged? Who profits when a nation agrees to feel nothing about its own account book? When you convince a people that a debt is too old to name, you do not erase the debt. You only erase the memory of who was paid. I have sat with this for years, and I keep landing in the same place. The argument is not really about whether the past can be measured. It is about making sure you never look at the measurement that already exists. Think about who is served by that forgetting. Not the descendants of the enslaved, who carry the loss without the record. It is the inheritors of the payment who are served. The families and firms whose fortunes were topped up by the state and never questioned since. Silence is not neutral. Silence has a beneficiary. And in this story, the beneficiary is always the same side of the ledger that got paid the first time. So how does a payment of £20 million vanish from a nation's memory? Not by conspiracy, by curriculum. The abolition of slavery is taught as a clean moral victory. William Wilberforce, the good Christian reformers, the candle of conscience lighting up a dark empire. And that story is not false. Those reformers were real. But it is only half the page. The other half, the half with the pound signs and the owners' names, rarely makes it into a school textbook or a Sunday afternoon documentary. Many of us grew up hearing the hymn and never seeing the invoice. That is the missing half of the abolition story. Britain did not simply free the enslaved and walk away lighter. Britain negotiated. Britain calculated. Britain wrote compensation into the very law that ended bondage, and then borrowed a fortune to honor it. The victory and the payout were the same act. You cannot separate the candle from the coin. When you only teach the candle, you produce a nation that is genuinely bewildered when the descendants of the enslaved ask about the coin. And I want to be fair to that bewilderment, because it is real. Many people who dismiss reparations are not villains. They are simply working from the version they were handed. The version with the reformers, and none of the receipts. That is why I am not interested in shouting tonight. I am interested in showing, because once you have seen the invoice, the polite version cannot unsee itself. The argument does not survive contact with the document, so let me set the stage. Picture Britain in 1833. The empire stretches from the sugar islands of the Caribbean to the cotton ports of India, and plantation wealth is not some distant colonial affair. It sits inside Parliament itself. Members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords own estates worked by enslaved people. They are not neutral judges of abolition. They are the very men whose fortunes are about to change. When the vote comes, they are voting on their own bank accounts, and that is not a small detail. It is the whole engine. Imagine a courtroom where the jury owns the thing on trial. Imagine asking the men who profit from a system to design the terms of its ending. Of course, they built themselves a soft landing. Of course, they wrote a check to themselves into the law. The wonder is not that it happened. The wonder is that we were taught to call it pure conscience. Hold that image, because it answers the whole video. When a legislature full of slave owners decides how slavery should end, who do you think that legislature is going to protect? That is the single question this receipt answers, not with speculation, not with my feelings, with a figure, a date, and a list of names sitting in a public archive right now. Let me walk you into it. Let me take you to the document itself. In August of 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. On paper, it is a triumph. It declares that slavery across most of the British Empire will end. And when you read the headline, it sounds like the whole cage swung open at once. But the act did not take effect the day it was signed. It came into force on the 1st of August, 1834, nearly a year later. And even then, freedom arrived with an asterisk pressed into the very first clauses. The word abolition was printed in large letters. The conditions were printed in small ones. I want you to imagine that 1st of August as it actually was. Across Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, and the other colonies, hundreds of thousands of people gathered to hear what the new law meant for them. Some held prayer meetings through the night. They had been told that freedom was coming. And when the morning came, they learned what kind of freedom the men in London had drawn up for them. Not the open sky they had prayed for. A narrower thing, with a fence around it, and a clock still running against them. Here is the first condition, and I want you to feel how strange it is. The act did not simply free people, it reclassified them. Enslaved people over the age of 6 were not turned into free citizens on that August morning. They were turned into something the law called apprentices. That word sounds gentle. It sounds like a young man learning a trade, earning a wage, building a future. It was nothing of the kind. Under the apprenticeship system, the formerly enslaved were required to keep working for their former owners without pay. Not for a week, not for a season, for years. They owed something like 40 to 45 hours of unpaid labor every single week, to the very people who had held them in bondage. They could be punished. They could be whipped. The overseer still stood in the field. The only thing that had changed was the paperwork. Freedom, on that first morning, was a promise with a delivery date set years in the future, and the plan was for that delivery date to be 1840 for the field workers. 6 long years of unpaid apprenticeship. It was only cut short to 1838 after the apprenticeship system proved so brutal, so obviously slavery under a new name, that even in Britain the protests grew too loud to ignore. Think about what that tells you. The gentler version of bondage was so cruel that it collapsed 2 years early under its own shame. That is the freedom the act delivered on day 1. Now here is the part the headline never mentions. Tucked inside that same act of liberation was a clause about money. The law that freed the enslaved also arranged to pay the enslavers. Written into the statute was a plan to compensate slave owners for what the law itself described as their loss of property. Read that phrase slowly. Loss of property. In the eyes of that act, the human beings walking out of the cane fields were not the wronged party. They were the property. And the wronged party, the party owed restitution, was the man who had lost them. The number attached to that clause was 20 million pounds. I will unpack the full weight of that figure in a moment, because it is almost impossible to overstate. But sit with the structure of it first. The same document, the same signatures, the same afternoon in Parliament, did 2 things at once. It ended legal slavery, and it opened the treasury to the slaveholders. 1 pen, 2 acts. A candle in one hand and a check in the other. This is why I keep coming back to the difference between the moral theater and the ledger. The moral theater is the story we all know. Wilberforce rising in the Commons, the long campaign of conscience, the great British soul choosing righteousness. And I do not want to strip that story of everything. Real people fought slavery at real cost, and I honor them. But the theater is not the transaction. The transaction is in the ledger. And the ledger recorded something the theater never mentions. It recorded who Britain chose to make whole. When the accounts were settled, the state did not calculate what it owed the men and women whose stolen labor had built the sugar fortunes, the shipping empires, the grand country houses. It calculated what it owed the owners. It sent assessors to weigh the value of human beings and cut checks to the people who had claimed to own them. Many of us were handed the theater in school and never shown the ledger. Let me linger on that phrase in the statute one more time, because it is the hinge of everything. Loss of property. When the British Parliament sat down to write the end of slavery, it had a choice about language, and language is never neutral. It could have written of a debt owed to the enslaved. It could have named the theft of their years, their children, their labor. Instead, it named the loss felt by the men who had held them. In the grammar of that act, the victim of abolition was the slave owner, robbed of his valuable stock, and the state stepped forward as his insurer. Read that way, the whole 20 million pounds is really an insurance payout on a policy taken against the freedom of human beings. And I want you to notice something about the timing that we skipped too fast. The compensation was not an afterthought, tacked on years later once the enslaved were free. It was baked into the deal from the start. There would have been no abolition without it. The planter class, which held enormous power in Parliament, made it clear they would not surrender their so-called property without being paid, and the government agreed. The freedom of hundreds of thousands of people was, in effect, purchased from their owners, with public money, as the price of their consent. That is the transaction underneath the triumph. Think about what that means. The enslaved did not receive their freedom as a right restored. They received it as a commodity that the state bought from someone else on their behalf, and then never billed them for, but never credited them for either. Their liberty had a price tag, and the price was paid to the man who had stolen it. If you have ever wondered why the abolition story feels a little too clean when you read it in a school book, this is the reason. The book keeps the moment of freedom and quietly loses the invoice attached to it. So keep both of those things in your mind as we go forward. The candle and the coin, the speech and the check, because the men who gave the beautiful speeches and the men who cashed the beautiful checks were often sitting in the same chamber, on the same afternoon, voting on the same page. Tonight, we are going to read the ledger. And once you have seen who Parliament chose to pay, the polite version of this story never quite fits again. Let me put a real weight on this number, because £20 million in 1834 is not a figure you can feel by just hearing it. So let me translate it into something your body understands. That payout was somewhere close to 40% of the entire national budget of the British government that year. Sit with that. Not 40% of one department. Not 40% of some colonial fund. Nearly half of everything the state spent, in a single year, committed to paying the owners of the people it had just freed. Think about what 40% of a national budget means. It is the kind of number a country reaches for in a war, or a famine, or a collapse. It is an emergency-sized sum, and Britain reached for it not to rebuild a shattered region, not to feed the starving, not to give land or wages to the newly free, but to reimburse the men who had lost their human property. I have gone looking, and I keep finding the same verdict from historians. It was the largest single government payout of its era. There was simply nothing else on the books that came close. Let me give you another way to feel it. Measured in today's money, that £20 million runs into the billions. Different historians land on different figures, depending on how you weigh it against the whole economy it came out of, but the numbers reach into the many billions of pounds. Whatever exact figure you choose, the shape is the same. This was one of the largest financial commitments the British state had ever made. Larger than most wars, larger than most public works, and it was made on behalf of enslavers. It was, in its day, an act of national generosity aimed with terrible precision at the wrong people. So how do you spend that kind of money without collapsing your own treasury? You cannot pull it from petty cash. And this is where the story stops being about conscience and starts being about finance. The British state could not actually afford to write that check. It did not have £20 million sitting in a vault waiting to be handed to the planters. What it had was the ability to borrow and the willingness to make future generations pay. But before we follow the money out the treasury door, I want you to hold the human shape of it. Somewhere in the Caribbean, a man who has been whipped into the cane for 30 years is told he is now free and still owes his old master unpaid labor. And somewhere in London, that same master is filling out a claim form, calculating his compensation down to the shilling. The freed man gets a delivery date. The master gets a check. That is not an accident of history. That is the design of the law, written in the same ink. So let me show you the machinery. To hand out £20 million, and I use the word handout bitterly, Britain built an entire bureaucracy. It was called the Slave Compensation Commission. Picture a government office in London, staffed with clerks and assessors, its desks stacked with claim forms mailed in from Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, and beyond. Assistant commissioners were posted out in the colonies to check the claims against local registers of the enslaved. Its whole job was to process the paperwork of loss, not the loss of the enslaved, the loss of the enslavers, and the process was precise in a way that still turns my stomach. To file a claim, an owner listed the human beings he had held. Each person was assigned a cash value. A field laborer was worth one amount. A skilled worker, a carpenter or a boiler man who could read the sugar, was worth more. A child was worth less. An elderly person, less still. The values even varied by colony, according to what the local sugar economy could bear. The commission reviewed these valuations, resolved the disputes, and approved the payouts. Human lives, reduced to a column of numbers, audited by civil servants, and converted into compensation. This was not a mob. It was a filing system. Sit with that image for a second, because it is the quiet horror of the whole story. There was no rage in that London office, no fury. Just ink and arithmetic. A man in a clean coat, checking a claim, confirming that yes, this planter had indeed owned 240 souls, and yes, the arithmetic entitled him to his sum. Evil rarely looks like a monster. Often it looks like a well-kept ledger and a patient clerk.
I think that is what unsettled me most. The cruelty had been fully domesticated into routine office work. Now, here's a piece that turned a scandal into something larger. The government did not actually have the 20 million pounds, so it's borrowed.
Roughly 15 million of that sum was raised as a loan, arranged through the great financial houses of the age, a bond deal in which the names Nathan Rothschild and Moses Montefiore appear. In 1835, the British state issued government bonds to fund the payout. In plain language, Britain went to the bond market, borrowed a fortune to pay the slave owners, and pledged the taxes of its own citizens for generations to come to pay that loan back. Do you understand the sleight of hand there? A loan is a promise made by people today that will be kept by people not yet born. When Britain borrowed to pay the enslavers, it reached forward across time and put its hand into the pockets of children who would not draw breath for 100 years. The men who profited from the plantations would be long dead. The bill would still be arriving. Do you see what just happened? The debt did not land on the men who had profited from slavery. It landed on the public. It landed on ordinary taxpayers, year after year, decade after decade, most of whom never knew what line item they were funding. The slaveholders got their cash up front. The nation got the IOU. And that IOU, as you are about to see, would outlive nearly everyone who ever touched it. Let me slow down on the mechanics of that loan, because this is where most people lose the thread. And it is exactly the thread that matters. When a government borrows money, it does not borrow from the sky. It sells bonds, promises to pay to wealthy investors, and in return, it takes their cash today. Those investors then collect interest year after year for as long as the debt is outstanding. So when Britain floated 15 million pounds in bonds to pay the slave owners, it created a stream of income that would flow to bondholders for a very, very long time. Every year, a portion of the taxes collected from ordinary people would be routed into the pockets of whoever held those bonds. Now ask the natural question: who could afford to buy government bonds in 1835? Not the dock worker, not the washerwoman. The men with capital to invest were very often the same class of men who had grown rich from empire and trade in the first place, including, in some cases, the very families being compensated for their slaves. Picture the elegant symmetry of it. A planter receives his compensation check and turns around and invests part of it in the government bonds issued to fund that very compensation. He is paid by the state, and then paid again by the state, for lending back the money he was just given. The wealth simply circulates among the sane hands, gathering interest at every turn. That is why I keep saying this was not a single injustice, but a machine. A single injustice ends. A machine keeps running. And this machine was built to run for generations, converting the stolen labor of the enslaved into a permanent interest-bearing asset for the propertied class of Britain. Every design choice, the loan, the bonds, the long repayment, pushed the costs forward onto the many and the benefit upward to the few. You could not have engineered a more durable transfer of wealth if you had set out to do it on purpose. And perhaps, in a quiet way, someone did. And notice who stood in the middle of it all. The same banking houses that had helped finance the plantations, the ships, and the sugar trade were now positioned to profit a second time, this time from the very bonds issued to compensate the owners. Interest on the loan flowed back to investors for generations. One system, 2 paydays. I have come to believe that is the coldest detail in the whole receipt, and we are not done reading it yet. Now, I want to hand you the receipt itself, because this is the part that changes everything. For a long time, people could wave away this story as folklore, a grievance passed down, hard to pin, easy to dismiss. That is no longer true. There is a public archive, built by historians at University College London, called the Legacies of British Slave Ownership Database. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It is the ledger, digitized, searchable, and open to anyone with a connection. Let me tell you what is inside it. When that 20 million pounds went out, it did not vanish into a fog. Every payment was recorded. Every claim had a claimant. The database holds roughly 46,000 separate compensation awards. 46,000 times. A person or a firm walked up to the British state, listed the human beings they had owned, and collected money for their release.
And each of those transactions carries a name. This is what I mean when I say this is a ledger and not an opinion. You can look the names up. I have. The first time I sat with that database, something hit me that I did not expect.
It was not the size of the numbers. It was the ordinariness of the records. Neat entries, clean columns, names, parishes, the count of enslaved people, the sum awarded. The banality of it is the horror of it. A monstrous thing, filed as routine paperwork. When I first scrolled through it, I understood why the story had stayed buried so long, not because someone locked it away, but because it was hidden in plain sight, dressed as accounting. And here is the reflection I keep returning to. We are so used to being told that this history is unknowable, that the accounts are lost, that the whole thing is too far back to trace. Most teachers frame it that way, but the ledger says otherwise. The receipt was never destroyed. It was cataloged. It sat in the record the whole time, waiting for someone to open it and read the names out loud. So let me start reading. Let me read you some of the names, because this is where the story stops being abstract. Among the largest claimants in that database is a man named John Gladstone. If the surname sounds familiar, it should. He was the father of William Gladstone, who would go on to serve 4 times as Prime Minister of Britain. John Gladstone owned enslaved people on plantations in the Caribbean, and when abolition came, he filed his claims. The compensation he received was enormous, among the very largest single awards in the whole scheme, a fortune paid out for the many hundreds of human beings he had held across his estates. Let that settle. The father of one of Britain's most celebrated prime ministers was among the men reimbursed for losing his slaves. And the money did not evaporate. It became inheritance. It became the ground beneath a great political dynasty. Young William Gladstone even rose in Parliament to defend the compensation of the planters, his own father among them. This is what the ledger does, that the school book cannot. It draws a straight line from the auction block to the drawing rooms of power, and it puts a figure on every step. But John Gladstone is only one entry among tens of thousands. The database records ordinary gentry and grand aristocrats. It records clergymen who owned human beings. It records widows and spinsters collecting compensation on estates left to them, women who never saw a plantation but drew an income from one. It records merchants, lawyers, and financial partnerships, and it records the ancestors of families and public figures whose names still carry weight in modern Britain. Threads that historians have traced into politics, into literature, into the old banking houses of the city. I want to be careful here, because the point is not to put a curse on a bloodline. The point is a system. The wealth was real. It was paid by the state, and much of it was carried forward. And here is the honest part I have to add. Not every claimant was a grand villain in a mansion. Some were small holders who owned 2 or 3 people. Some were themselves in debt. The evil of this was not that every single name belonged to a cartoon monster. The evil was structural. An entire nation had woven the ownership of human beings so deeply into its economy that when the day came to end it, tens of thousands of ordinary, respectable people expected to be paid, and were. That is what a system looks like when it has been running for 200 years. And that is the thread that will not let me go. Follow the money forward. Compensation money did not sit in a box. It bought country estates. It bought paintings that now hang in galleries. It paid for railway shares and city mansions, and the education of sons who became lords and members of parliament. It was invested, and it compounded, quietly, across 4, 5, 6 generations. A payout made in 1835 does not stay in 1835. It grows. It becomes the down payment on advantages that outlive everyone who signed the original claim. Let me give you a fuller sense of who fills these pages, because the range of them is part of the horror. The historians at University College London who built this database did not just count the money. They traced where it went and who the recipients were, and the picture that emerges is not a handful of monstrous outliers. It is a broad cross-section of respectable British society. Members of Parliament, owners of great houses whose gardens tourists still walk through today, ancestors of writers, of bishops, of bankers, of men who would sit in the cabinet. The compensation did not flow to the margins of society. It flowed straight into its center. And I want to name a pattern the researchers found because it explains so much about the country that came after. A great deal of this compensation money did not simply pay off old debts or buy comfort. It was invested. It went into railways as Britain built the greatest rail network in the world. It went into the founding and expansion of businesses, some of which grew into famous firms. It went into the grand collections of art and the endowments of institutions. The wealth of the enslaved, converted into a government payout, became seed capital for the modern British economy. This is not a fringe claim. It is the documented finding of the archive itself. Sit with what that means for a moment. When we look at certain fortunes, certain estates, certain institutions that seem to have simply always been wealthy, we are sometimes looking at the downstream of that 1834 payout. The money changed shape. It stopped being a compensation check and became a country house, then a portfolio, then an inheritance, then simply old money whose origin no one asks about anymore. The database asks about it. It reconnects the polished present to the ledger that funded it. And here's a detail that I find quietly devastating. Because the payments were made to owners rather than to the enslaved, and because owners were disproportionately wealthy and well-connected, the compensation acted like a booster rocket strapped to families that were already flying high. It did not lift the fallen. It accelerated the already risen. Every pound of it widened a gap that was already wide, and then that gap was handed down, generation to generation, as if it were natural, as if it were merit, as if it had nothing to do with a boiler house in Jamaica. I have gone back to that archive more than once, and each time I come away with the same thought. We are always told that the past is complicated, that we cannot judge, that everyone was a product of their time, and there is some truth in that. But complexity is not the same as fog. When a thing is written down this precisely, the name, the parish, the number of human beings, the exact sum in pounds and shillings, it is no longer lost in the mist of history. It is on the record. And what is on the record can be reckoned with. These are not guesses I am making. These are ledger names, matched to sums, traceable in a public archive that anyone can open tonight. And the moment you can trace the wealth of the enslavers precisely, by name, by parish, by the exact number of pounds, the argument that this history is too vague to address simply falls apart in your hands.
You cannot call something unknowable when it has been alphabetized. You cannot call an account untraceable when the trace is published. The receipt named them. All of you have to do is read. Now have to turn the page to the other column. And this is the one that keeps me up.
We have counted what the owners received. Let me tell you what the enslaved received. Nothing. Not a coin. Not a shilling. Of the 20 million pounds. The people whose stolen labor had built the entire fortune, who had cut the cane, boiled the sugar, and filled the ships, walked out of bondage with empty hands and a bill still owed. Read the structure of it again, because it is almost too cruel to be real. The masters were paid for losing their property. The property was paid nothing for being held. There was no fund for the freed. No land grant, no back wages for the decades of unpaid work, no restitution of any kind. The state opened its treasury 40% wide for the enslavers and left the enslaved with exactly what they had the day before. Nothing, except a new legal word for their condition. I want you to really weigh that imbalance, because it is the whole moral center of this story. Two people stand in the same field on the same August morning. One of them has spent 30 years working that field under the whip, for no wage, building another man's fortune. The other has spent 30 years holding the whip. And when the law arrives to set things right, it walks past the first man without a glance and presses a check into the hand of the second. If you built a story like that, an editor would tell you it was too on the nose to be believed. And yet, it is simply the record, and that new legal word was apprentice. I told you it would come back. From 1834 to 1838, most of the formerly enslaved were bound to keep laboring for their old masters, unpaid, under the apprenticeship system. Freedom, for them, arrived not as release, but as a debt of work to be paid off.
Think about the moral shape of that. The person who was wrong is told they must labor for free to earn the freedom that should never have been withheld. The person who did the wronging is handed cash. I have sat with that inversions for a long time, and it never gets easier to hold.
The overseer did not disappear in 1834. The whip did not vanish. Punishment continued under the apprenticeship system, now with the blessing of a new law that called the whole arrangement progress. Special magistrates were shipped out to oversee it, and their own records describe floggings, treadmills, and punishments handed down to apprentices who stepped out of line. For 4 more years, freedom in the British Caribbean meant working the same fields for the same men, for no pay, under the same threat of the lash. The cage door was open. The chain, for a while longer, was still on. Let me say the thing plainly, because it is the heart of this whole receipt. The wrong side of the whip got paid. The hand that held the lash was compensated for its loss. The back that bore the lash was compensated for nothing. When you strip away the ceremony and the hymns and the noble speeches, that is the transaction the ledger records. Britain looked at a system built on stolen human beings, and when it came time to close the account, it paid the thieves and billed the public. And I want you to see why that inversion matters for the people watching me tonight. Because it did not end in 1838. When full emancipation finally came, the freed people were released into a world with no capital of their own, no inheritance, no savings, no compensation to build a farm, start a trade, or buy the land they had worked for free. Many were pushed straight back onto the plantations as low-wage laborers, because there was nowhere else to go and nothing to start with. They began at zero, worse than zero, because the men who had exploited them now held a fresh injection of government cash. Picture those 2 families walking forward from that year, side by side down the generations. One family carries a state-funded fortune, turned into land and shares and schooling. The other carries nothing but its own hands and its own faith. Give them 100 years. Give them 200. Which family do you think is standing on solid ground today, and which is still climbing? You do not need me to answer that. You can feel the answer in your own street, in your own family stories. That gap did not close on its own. It compounded exactly the way money compounds, generation after generation. This is one of the true origins of the wealth divide you can still measure today. Not a mystery of culture or character, but a head start purchased by law and paid for by the state. Many of us feel that gap in our own families without ever knowing its paperwork. Tonight, you are looking at part of the paperwork, and paperwork, unlike a rumor, can be answered. Let me stay in the fields a little longer, because I do not want this to become an argument about numbers and lose the people inside it. Picture a woman on a Jamaican estate in 1834. She has borne children who were sold away from her. She has worked cane from before dawn until after dark, for as long as she can remember. And now the law arrives and tells her she is an apprentice. She will keep cutting the same cane for the same man in the same field, for no wage for years to come. And the man she works for has just been paid by the government for the loss of her. She is the loss. She is the line item. She is standing right there, and the check has her price on it, made out to someone else. Now, carry her forward. When apprenticeship finally ended in 1838, what did she have? No land of her own, because land was kept expensive and out of reach on purpose, to keep former slaves dependent on plantation wages. No savings, because she had never been paid. No capital to start anything. Her freedom, when it came fully, was the freedom to keep laboring on someone else's terms, in a society engineered to make sure she could never accumulate enough to walk away. That was not an oversight. It was policy, backed by the same lawmakers who had just funded the planters, and the same story played out across the islands, hundreds of thousands of times over. A whole generation released from bondage into poverty, while a whole class of owners was released from slavery into wealth. Two exits from the same institution, on the same date, engineered to send the two sides in opposite directions. One rose, one was pinned in place, and the distance between them was not left to chance. It was purchased, with public money, and written into law. I think about the children of that woman, and her children's children, and the long line coming down to somebody watching this right now. Every generation started a step behind, not because of anything they lacked in mind or spirit, but because the starting line itself had been moved. When people today ask why a gap persists, they are often looking at the wrong century for the answer. The answer was set in 1834, in a decision about who would be paid and who would be billed. And here is where I have to be precise, so no one can twist my words. I am not indicting a race. I am indicting a system, a law, a compensation scheme, a decision made by a legislature to protect property over people. The enslaved got a bill. The enslavers got a check. That was not the accident of a cruel individual. It was the deliberate design of an act of parliament, engineered in the open, and I believe naming that design honestly is the first step toward ever setting it right. Now we come to the part of the receipt that almost no one believes until they see it. I told you Britain borrowed the money to pay the slave owners. I told you it issued bonds in 1835 and pledged the taxes of its citizens to pay that loan back. Here is the question that should stop you cold. When did that loan finally get paid off? Not in the 1830s. Not by the end of the century. Not after the First World War. Not after the Second. Hold the length of that in your mind. This was a debt that outlived the empire that created it. It survived Queen Victoria. It survived the age of steam and the age of oil. It survived 2 world wars and the loss of the very colonies where the slavery had happened. Through more than 180 years, the interest kept turning. The obligation kept rolling forward, folded into the vast machinery of the national debt, where no ordinary citizen would ever notice it. A single afternoon's decision in 1833 became a financial thread that ran through 6 generations. Let me make that stretch of time feel real. When the loan was taken out, the fastest thing on earth was a galloping horse. By the time it was paid off, human beings had walked on the moon and carried the internet in their pockets. Empires rose and fell. Kings and queens were crowned and buried. And the whole time, quietly in the accounts of the British Treasury, a debt raised to compensate slave owners kept its place on the books, being serviced year after year, like a light left on in a room. Everyone had forgotten. Think about what that means for the people footing the bill. For nearly 2 centuries, British taxpayers were servicing a loan that had been taken out to compensate slave owners, nurses, bus drivers, school teachers, dock workers, people who had never heard the name of the Slave Compensation Commission, quietly paying their share of a debt incurred to reimburse enslavers for their lost human property. The receipt did not close when slavery ended. It stayed open, generation after generation, hidden inside the ordinary business of the state. And here is the detail that turns the whole thing from history into something almost unbearable. Among the taxpayers still paying down that loan in the 21st century were the descendants of the very people who had been enslaved. Black Britons, the great-great-grandchildren of the men and women in that ledger, were contributing, through their taxes, to a debt taken on to pay the families that had once owned their ancestors. I have sat with that fact for a long time, and I still do not have a clean word for it. The bill for their own bondage, still landing in their own mailbox. Read that inversion one more time, slowly. A man in Birmingham, or London, whose great-great-grandmother was bought and sold on a Jamaican estate, goes to work, earns his wage, pays his taxes, and a sliver of those taxes goes to service a loan that once put money into the pocket of the family that owned her, the descendant of the enslaved, helping to pay off the compensation of the enslaver. If a novelist wrote that, you would call it too bitter to be true. It was simply the arithmetic of the national debt. So let me give you the date. The year that loan was finally cleared from the books was 2015. Read that again. 2015. Not a date in a dusty history. A date many of you remember clearly. Smartphones in every pocket. Barack Obama in the White House. And in that same modern year, British taxpayers made the last payments on a debt raised to compensate slave owners in 1835. For most of us alive today, this was not ancient history. It was current events. And you do not have to take my word for any of it, because the British government itself confirmed it. In February of 2018, His Majesty's Treasury, the official finance department of the British state, posted a message on social media as a piece of trivia. It said, in effect, that millions of people had continued paying for the abolition of slavery until as recently as 2015, because the government had borrowed the money to compensate slave owners, and that today's taxpayers had helped end slavery through those payments. They framed it as a fun fact, a cheerful nugget of history to brighten your afternoon. Read the tone of that again, because the tone is the tell. The Treasury thought it was sharing something heartwarming. Look, you helped end slavery. They did not seem to grasp what they were actually confessing, that the money had gone to the owners, that the public had funded the slaveholders' payout for 180 years, that among those paying were the descendants of the enslaved. The government had told the truth by accident, dressed up as a feel-good fact. The reaction was not cheerful. When people understood what the Treasury had just admitted, the response was fury, and the tweet was deleted. But you cannot delete a national debt from the historical record. The admission had already been made, in the government's own words, and screenshots do not forget. The state had told on itself. Let me stay with that 2018 admission a little longer, because of how it happened. Nobody forced the Treasury to say it. There was no journalist holding their feet to the fire. No court order. No leaked document. A government department, on an ordinary day, decided to share a piece of history it thought was charming. And in doing so, it confirmed, in black and white, the very fact that had been dismissed as conspiracy for years. When the state itself tells you that taxpayers were paying off slave owner compensation until 2015, you no longer need me. You need only quote the government back to itself. And think about why they deleted it. They did not delete it because it was false. They deleted it because it was true, and the truth landed badly. The moment people did the simple arithmetic, that the money went to owners, that the public paid for it, that black taxpayers were among those paying, the charm curdled into horror. The deletion is its own kind of confession. You do not scramble to erase a harmless fact. You scramble to erase one that reveals more than you meant to reveal. That, to me, is the whole story in miniature. For nearly 2 centuries, the receipt sat in plain view, technically public, practically ignored. Then for one careless moment, the government held it up to the light as a fun fact, saw the nation's face change, and yanked it back down. But you cannot unring that bell. The figure is known, the date is known, the recipients are named, and the confession, screenshot and shared before it vanished, is part of the record now too. So let me read the receipt back to you, all of it, in one breath. 20 million pounds, roughly 40% of the national budget, paid beginning in 1834. Paid not to the freed, but to the slave owners, for the loss of their human property. Financed by a loan raised on the bond market in 1835, serviced by taxpayers, including black British taxpayers, for 180 years. Finally paid off in 2015, confirmed by the Treasury's own hand in 2018. Every name of every claimant, preserved in a public archive at University College London. This is not a rumor. This is not a grievance without a paper trail. This is a ledger, and you have now read it. So now let us go back to where we started, to the argument on the television and the noise online. Many critics say reparations for slavery are absurd, unprecedented, a fantasy that no serious nation would ever entertain. And here is the answer I believe the ledger puts in your hand. Reparations for British slavery are not unprecedented. They already happened. Britain has already run this exact program once. It built the commission, calculated the sums, issued the bonds, and paid out for 200 years. The precedent is not hypothetical. It is historical fact, recorded by the state itself. There is only one thing the critics have to leave out to make their case, and it is the most important thing. Britain did pay reparations for slavery, and many historians document it plainly. It simply paid the wrong side. It compensated the owners for the loss of their property, and it gave the human property nothing. So when someone tells you reparations could never work, that the sums could never be calculated, that the beneficiaries could never be identified, the honest reply is that Britain calculated the sums to the shilling and identified the beneficiaries by name almost 200 years ago. It just aimed the payment at the enslavers. This is the argument, in my view, that the outrage machine cannot answer. Watch how the objections collapse one by one against the record. Too complicated to calculate? They calculated it, person by person, colony by colony. Impossible to find who is owed. They found 46,000 recipients and paid every one. Too far in the past to matter? The final payment cleared in 2015, when you already owned a smartphone. Every single reason many people give for why reparations cannot happen was already overcome, in practice, by the British state, the moment the beneficiary was a slave owner instead of a freed man. The machinery works. It has always worked. The only question was ever which direction it would face. Now look again at what happened in Accra in July of 2026. The CARICOM nations and the African Union, with leaders like Mia Mottley and John Mahama, adopting their 19-point reparations manifesto. Held up against this receipt, that demand looks completely different to me, and I believe to many of you watching, doesn't it? It is not a novel request for a handout. It is a correction of the ledger. It is the descendants of the property side of that transaction asking that the account finally be balanced. The other way. Not a new idea. The oldest idea in the file. Turned right side up. And notice the shape of the claim. These are named states, holding a documented debt, not a vague grievance floating in the air, but a specific transaction, with a figure, a date, and an archive. When you understand the receipt, the 2026 manifesto stops sounding like a shakedown and starts sounding like an invoice sent back to the address it should have gone to in the first place. The Caribbean nations are not inventing a debt. They are pointing at one that Britain itself created, financed, and confessed to. Let me return to the coldest thread in the whole ledger, because it deserves a full accounting. Remember how the 20 million was raised, through a loan floated on the bond market, arranged with the great financial houses of the age. That means the same institutions that had helped finance the plantations and the slave ships in the first place were now positioned to profit from the bonds that compensated the owners. Profit from the system going up, profit from the system coming down. One machine, 2 paydays, and some of those financial houses did not vanish into history. Their successors are names you would still recognize in the city of London today. Sit with that structure for a moment, because it is the part I find hardest to shake. The wealth did not just flow to the individual planters. It flowed through the banks, into bonds, back to investors, and forward into the modern financial world. The enslaved built the capital. The owners were paid for releasing it. And the institutions in the middle collected on both ends of the transaction. When people ask where the money went, this is the honest answer. It went up the chain and forward in time, and a great deal of it is still there. So why was all of this buried? Why is the 20 million pounds not taught beside the name of Wilberforce in every classroom? I do not think it takes a grand conspiracy to explain it. A paid receipt is, I believe, simply inconvenient. It undermines the comfortable defense that reparations are too complicated, too vague, too far in the past to ever address. Because if the state could identify every slave owner and pay them to the shilling in 1834, then the claim that the enslaved side is somehow impossible to identify collapses. The precedent itself is the danger. That, I have come to believe, is the real reason this receipt stayed in the shadows. not because it was locked in a vault, but because it was never convenient to teach. A nation can hold a candle-lit story of its own goodness, or it can hold the invoice, but it is very hard to hold both at once and feel comfortable. So the invoice was allowed to gather dust, technically public, practically invisible, mentioned by no one who did not go looking. Let me put one more piece on the table, because it answers the objection that always comes next. Someone will say, fine, the owners were paid, but that was long ago, and nobody today is responsible for what their great-great-grandfather did, and there is a human truth in that. No child is guilty of an ancestor's sin, but responsibility for a wrong and inheritance of its proceeds are two different things. You can be entirely innocent of how a fortune was made and still be sitting on it. The question Reparations asks, and many are asking it now, is not who is guilty. It is where did the money go, and is it still doing work? And the ledger answers plainly. It went to the owners, it was invested, it compounded, and a great deal of it is still doing work today. That is why the receipt matters so much more than an apology. An apology addresses feeling, a receipt addresses fact. When a nation apologizes, it says we are sorry for the past. When a nation reads its own receipt, it must admit something harder, that the past is not past, that it is still earning interest, still shaping who owns what, still present in the account books of the living. You cannot fully close a wound while the mechanism that opened it is still turning over a profit. And I want to be fair once more, because fairness is the only thing that makes this credible. Reckoning with this receipt is genuinely complicated. Who exactly is owed, and how, and by whom, are hard questions with no easy arithmetic. I do not stand here pretending the answer is simple. But there is a world of difference between a question that is hard and a question that is illegitimate. The critics want you to believe the whole subject is illegitimate, made up, groundless, a shakedown. The receipt proves it is merely hard, and hard questions are the kind that serious nations are supposed to be brave enough to sit with. And here is where I land, after sitting with this for a long time. The record was never hidden in a vault. It was catalogued, published, and eventually confessed to by the Treasury's own hand. It sat in the archive the whole time, in neat columns, waiting. The burial was not of the document. It was of our attention. Tonight, you have paid attention. And once a receipt like this has been read out loud, in my experience, it does not go back in the drawer. So let me leave you with what you are holding now, because it is more than a story. You came in tonight maybe half remembering that slavery ended in the British Empire in the 1830s. You leave with the receipt. 20 million pounds, roughly 40% of the national budget, paid beginning in 1834, not to the freed people but to the slave owners, for the loss of what the law called their property, financed by a loan raised in 1835 and paid off by taxpayers only in 2015. Confirmed by the Treasury's own words in 2018. Every claimant named in the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database at University College London. That is not a feeling. That is a fact you can cite. And that is the difference I hope you carry out of here. The next time someone tells you reparations are absurd, unprecedented, impossible to calculate, and many will, you will not have to argue from emotion. You can answer from the record. You can say that Britain already paid reparations for slavery once. I believe the record is clear on this, that it paid the exact wrong side, and that the government admitted as much in its own words in 2018.
I have sat with its history for a long time. I have come to believe that being armed with a ledger is its own kind of freedom. They cannot tell you the account never existed when you have read it line by line.
Let me speak to the person who came to this feeling tired of the argument. Tired of being told that the past is nobody's fault and everybody's imagination. Hear me. You were not imagining it. The imbalance you feel in your bones has a paper trail. It has a figure and a date. What was taken from one side and handed to the other was written down, filed, and paid. And now you know where to find it. That knowledge will not undo a single day of what happened, but it will keep anyone from telling you it never did. Now hear me on this last thing, because it matters more than the numbers. This is not a story that asks you to hate anyone. All people, all nations, are one family under God. But you have to know the truth, to walk in it without fear. The point of reading a receipt is not vengeance. It is honesty. It is the simple insistence that an account be told the way it actually happened, so that the next conversation about justice starts from the record instead of from a comfortable myth. So here is where I leave you. If this history moved something in you, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city in the comments. And if there is a name in your own family line this receipt made you think of, say it here so the rest of us can honor it with you. Share this with one person who has been told this whole subject is too old to matter. And if you want more of these buried ledgers pulled back into the light, subscribe and stay with me. Because the receipt was here the whole time. Tonight, you finally read it.